Welcome. Margaret Petty, who's right here, is an expert on architectural lighting design and design history. She has been published in such lighting industry publications as Luminous, Professional Lighting Design, and Architectural Lighting. Formerly the thesis director for the MFA Lighting Design program at Parsons, she may have excellent advice for those of you in second year. She is currently the head of the School of Design at the Victoria University of Wellington, as well as a senior lecturer. Please welcome Margaret Petty.
I don't need that mic, right? No, thank you. Okay, excellent. I didn't want to have to coordinate those hands in my mind at the same time. So thank you everyone for coming out tonight. It's really, even if it's compulsory, an honor for me to be here. And I also want to say a very special thank you to Alan, although he's not here tonight, for inviting me to come and speak with you. I'm really excited, and also to Gabrielle and Alicia and Marco for organizing all the details, because as if you don't know, hopefully you do, Wellington's in New Zealand. It's on the other side of the planet. Oscar Pipson's from the same university I'm from, so we have a special bond. And it's a long way to get here, so it takes a lot of organizing. And so it's good. It's good to be here, and I'm excited to be back in New York City. As what you were saying in the introduction, I'm used to be from New York City and teach at Parsons, so it's nice to have a homecoming here. But I'm particularly excited to be here at the School of Visual Arts and the Products of Design department, because I think from my outsider perspective, this is one of the most exciting design programs in the world today. I'm just going to make a bold statement. I think what you guys are doing and the kinds of questions you're asking and what you're investigating is really at the fore of what's happening in the profession today. It's you guys that are going to lead us in a new direction. That's what I believe Alan is trying to do. And I think if Alan wants to do something, he's going to succeed. So I'm excited to be here to have a chance to talk to you and give you a little bit of my insights. I mean, not only have I spent a lot of time studying and working on architectural lighting design as a historian and theorist and critic, I've spent a lot of time thinking about design education, particularly in my role as an administrator and someone who teaches future designers like yourself. And I feel quite strongly that we need to be very thoughtful about what we do today and where we're going in the future in terms of design as a profession and an industry. So I took inspiration for my talk tonight from a manifesto, actually, that Alan wrote called 1,000-Word Manifesto. Hopefully you've all read it by now and know this phrase, the consequence business. But I think what's really great about this idea of the consequence business is that's exactly what you all are doing. That's what we're engaged in. We can call it design if we want, but it's something much bigger and much greater than that, and has a significant impact on where we go as a society and as cultures. So I want to think about that this afternoon, and because I am a historian, like if we just put aside the lighting design for now, basically I'm trained as a design historian, and what I do is look at what's happened and what that means and how we can make sense of it. And there was one thing that a historian knows is that it's really hard to make sense of the present because it's hard to look back on. And so everything is sort of in the moment, and we're trying to figure out what it all means and what we should be doing. And it's very easy to sit back and look at the past and say, oh, that was a good idea, or that was a really bad idea. It's much harder to do in the present. So what I want to do tonight is do a little back and forth. I want to go back to the past and look at some things and then move forward to the present and maybe see what we can learn about that, about the choices we make as designers and where we go. So what I really want to do, hopefully at the end of our talk this afternoon, is to give you a kind of provocation to think about a couple of things. First of all, why are you here? Why are you in this program? What do you want to do in terms of being a designer? What does design mean to you? What do you hope to achieve? What is it that you're going to add to your culture or to the history of design? And not just design, but this world and this time and this place that we're in. I think there's a really unique position, as I said, that design is poised in to make a difference in the world. But whether or not this is a difference that's towards positive change or not is really up to all of you. So let's think about that, but let's have some fun too. I don't want to be too doom and gloom. So, all right, Oscar will get this. Historian, who's this man? Let's have someone tell me. Very good, yes. We have at least one budding historian in the crowd. It's excellent. So Raymond Loewy, who was he? He was a French-born American industrial designer. And some people really credit him with creating industrial design in the United States. And he was probably one of the first household names in terms of design in the United States. He became very well known for a type of styling of products, and a far cry from, let's say, what was happening in Europe in the same time, which was really a much more functional, utilitarian aesthetic that was associated with modernism. Loewy was about making things sexy and appealing and beautiful and desirous. And this was really the context in which he was working. So when he first started industrial design in the United States, it was right around the time of the Great Depression, which was 1929 to 1939, basically, as you probably know. And the Great Depression, obviously, was caused by the stock market crash of 1929, which sent Wall Street into a panic, wiped out millions of investors, and over the next several years, consumer spending dropped, investment dropped, and the majority of banks in the United States closed, essentially. And by 1933, 13 to 15 million Americans were unemployed. That was nearly a very significant portion of the population. So this was not a great situation for the country, for people, for the youth of the United States. And there was a lot of discussion about how could people get out of the Depression. And obviously one of the ways that industry was looking at was to increase consumer spending. You increase spending, then you increase revenue, disposable income, industry thrives. It's a kind of self-sustaining prophecy. So there was a lot of interest in how can we drive the consumer market? How can we get people to spend what little money they have? So enter the industrial designer. Part of the role of the industrial designer was to create the desire in people to buy things. And Raymond Loewy's designs were, in many ways, something we might criticize today, but largely cosmetic. And he was looking at making objects that could project ideas about modernity, that gave hope and looked at the future and what the future could be. So this was one of his first designs for the cold spot refrigerator for General Electric. This is what it looked like before. You can see a kind of clunky, not so interesting thing. And what he did was he created a casing for it and made it smooth and what we now call streamlined, and made the internal mechanisms or the shelving units more rationalized. But as far as the technology that went into it, there wasn't any change. It was still the same sort of functionality. It just looked better. So what Loewy was really trying to do was to create this desire and this desire to purchase. And others like him, and he was successful. I mean, it was really through the power of the consumer economy and some savvy government investment that the United States started to come out of the Great Depression. But the thing that's interesting is that, Loewy didn't just sell more refrigerators. I mean, obviously that was a great success, and it's a success story in terms of the history of design. But along with that idea of the future and this new refrigerator and it being clean and hygienic and futuristic looking, and the idea of this hopefulness, and that suddenly, this is a refrigerator that's full. It's full of food. This is not people standing in a bread line. This is a refrigerator that's packed. I can't even imagine how you could get something out of it without sort of things tumbling. It's a kind of proliferation of goods and consumables. So he wasn't really, as I said, just selling refrigerators. He was selling engines of desire in many ways. And he was quite, forward about this. I mean, he said one of his famous quotes is that the most beautiful curve is a rising sales graph. Like that was success, right? That you sold more and more, and you know, and he created so many designs that you can't even really, I can't go into it tonight. But this was Loewy on the cover of Time magazine in 1949, and he's, you know, surrounded by all of these things that he's designed, and there's that idea that more is good, and this abundance, and that the power to consume is equated in the first half of the 20th century, particularly in the United States, with quality of life and the American way of living. And you see this imagery again and again, and this is, I just like the refrigerator analogy, but this cornucopia, this overflowing abundance of consumer goods. And we look at that, we think about that trajectory and what Loewy was doing, and the idea that design is really in service of selling things and of selling more things, whether or not it's about technological innovation or about styling, as Loewy did. And then I can't help but think of, you know, Costco, right? This is a crazy environment. When I go into Costco, I just think, you know, when did we decide that we need to store a year's worth of food in our own homes? And some of these things that you buy, you can't even consume before they go rotten, and you have to throw them out because they're just, you know, unless you have a family of 20, and who has a family of 20? If you own a store, that might make sense, or a restaurant, but I go to Costco with my mother. She has, you know, I'm not at home anymore, like she's just buying for my dad, and she's got this cart of things that are overflowing, and I can't help but think, you know, this is a long time in the making. This didn't just arrive out of nowhere, that this is tied to a methodology and a way of thinking and a way of looking at the world that's particularly American, and I think has a lot to do with the origins of modernity in the United States. So for me, this is what, you know, this is the consequence business. This is what we're talking about. That I don't think when Loewy was designing the cold spot refrigerator, he was imagining Costco, but I think that there is a relationship there, and I think that choice and what he was choosing to do led to types of consumer behavior that we see at an extreme today. So now let's switch to the future, or to the current day, not the future yet. These are some of our current name brand or home name recognizable designers of the last, I don't know, 10 or 15 years. So this is kind of fun. This should be easier. Let's do the name these guys. And just for the record, they're all guys, okay? There's a lot of guys in design, so it's good to have some women out there. So let's start, this is the easy one. We'll start with the easy one in the corner. Yes, and? Right, very good. This one's a little bit harder, but I had to include it. What's that? Oh, you guys are so good. Yeah. Yeah. In the middle. Yes, right. And last but not least. Great. You guys did way better than my students in New Zealand. So these guys have a lot of impact, or have had, on what's happening in design, and as I said, in the last few years. I picked all of these photographs in particular because I think they're portraying a kind of designer as genius pose. You see it in all of them, or kind of hero. Marcel Wanders on the white horse is my personal favorite. So I thought, well, let's do a little exercise and see. I mean, I talked a bit about Loewy and what he did. Let's look at what some of the things these designers are doing. Now, I'm not going to go with the obvious, you know, the iPhone or something like that. We're going to do something a little different. So the one of a kind, now this was a collaboration, the Mark Newsome, Johnny Ives Red Leica camera. This was designed for the Red charity, which is great. And it was amazing in that this particular camera in the corner sold, did anybody read this? Do you guys know how much this sold for auction? $1.8 million. $1.8 million, astounding at a charity auction. But it's, you know, it's a charity, it's a good thing. And the camera went through 561 prototype models to reach this final stage of perfection. So maybe it was worth it, but it's interesting. So this is something that they worked on together for quite a bit. Now, up in the corner, we have Mark Newsome's Kelvin 40 concept jet. This was designed in 2003 and it was commissioned by the Cartier Foundation in Paris. And it was exhibited first in 2004. I can't find how much it cost to make. I couldn't find that, so if someone can find it, let me know. But anyway, event, it doesn't fly. It's just a concept jet to think about space travel, or anyway, it's lovely design. And then we have in the center Marcel Wander's famous, very playful porcelain vase. Now this was made by stuffing eggs into latex rubber condoms, hard-boiled eggs, and then it was the form was turned into a vase, and this was developed for the Droog design. So it's a nice, kind of cute play on eggs and the condom and what have you. So it's kind of a fun one. Karen Rashid has the stools up at the top. These are for children. They're roto-molded polyethylene stools that can interchange. So all of these are nice designs. I think aesthetically, depending on what you're interested in, or intellectually, they can pique your interest. The last one we haven't talked about, of course, is Philippe Starck's Juicy Salif. And I saved it for last because it's my favorite. It's a great story. If you haven't heard the story of the creation of the Juicy Salif, I'll tell you. If you have heard it, just bear with me. So Philippe Starck, imagine, he's having lunch one day on the Amalfi Coast, and he's ordered a plate of calamari, and he's pondering his latest commission from Lasc. Now they've asked him to design a tray, like a serving tray. And he really feels like, a tray, how boring, a tray, what am I gonna do, a tray? And he's sitting there, really artist block, he can't think of what to do. And he looks down at his plate, and he realizes that they didn't bring him any leaven with his calamari. And then, like a vision from heaven, he sees the Juicy Salif, and he sketches it on a cocktail napkin. And now the cocktail napkin's on display in Italy in a museum, so you can go see it. And this classic design has come to be. Now I have a colleague that I work with that worked with Philippe Starck many years ago, and he loves the Juicy Salif and always defends it when I attack it. And I said, well, what good is it really? It sucks as a juicer. It's not a good juicer. It's messy. And he said, well, it's the perfect wedding gift, Like if you need to give somebody a wedding gift, that's the thing. Now, I don't know. I'm not sure that we really need perfect wedding gifts like the Juicy Salif anymore. So all of this kind of design, I have to say, I call heroic design. And I think we just don't need it. We don't need heroic design. If you want to do it, go forth, be happy in life. But I'm going to stand up here tonight and say, no, we don't need it. We really don't need the hero genius designer who's creating fantastically perfect, beautiful objects that you can give as a wedding present. Like, we have way more important things to do. There'll always be heroic designers, but I think, as design media and as people who care about design, that we can do a lot better, and we can do much more interesting things. So let's move into the past again and talk about something mid-century modernism, because it's something that we hear a lot about today, and we see a lot in design. There's a real nostalgia and I think romanticizing of this period. And I don't know if people really always know what this particular time and place was about in American design history. So in the early 1940s, this is Gilbert Brody. He was a Brooklyn-born self-taught furniture designer. And he was a pretty bold guy. He went to Herman Miller in Zeeland, Michigan, and he went to the president of Herman Miller, DJ Dupree, and he said to him, you can't keep doing what you're doing. It's not acceptable. And this is what they were doing, right? Bedroom suites, dining room suites, suites of furniture in historical styles that were made in a way that Rody thought was immoral and not okay in the modern era. And he said, we have to change, that lifestyles have changed, and that requires a new way of living and a new type of furniture, and that people were living in smaller houses, they couldn't accommodate large-scale pieces, these big, heavy pieces of furniture were hard to clean. You wasted effort, dusting and polishing them. He thought that these traditional designs that Herman Miller were making were not only grandiose and pretentious, but they were essentially stolen from earlier makers. So at this time there were pattern books. So if you were a designer working for Herman Miller, you'd sort of pick a pattern and then apply it to a suite of furniture from a pattern book. So it was more of a kind of composite than a real design process. So Rohde went to Dupree and said that the company was doing this thing that was really unethical in terms of the intention of design, and that their manufacturing techniques similarly were quite artificial, and that there were decorative elements that were used to cover up joins and things, so that it wasn't really being honest about what it was in terms of furniture. And Dupree was really convinced by this argument, and he finally said, that he came to see that what they were doing was essentially immoral, which is almost hard to believe at that time, to think that creating furniture was immoral because of the style you were using and the way in which you were constructing it. So these were really important questions for the designers at the time. This was actually at the heart of what was happening in American design. And Gilbert Rohde was quite active, and he wrote about the industry and what was happening. And he said, at present, conditions and practices existing in the furniture trade tend to inhibit the development of furniture that has a really superior economic value. From the physical setup of factories to retail promotion. Factories are not equipped to permit a free use of modern materials and efficient production methods. Retailers and magazines seek only to increase the rapidity of obsolescence and cater to established prejudices. That was a pretty big indictment of the industry. It certainly didn't make Gilbert Rohde any friends, but it did change the way of thinking of a number of people. So this is a showroom that Gilbert Rohde designed in 1939 for Herman Miller in Chicago. And this was considered revolutionary. And the reason they built the showroom was to show people how you could live with modern furniture. Like, it was considered so out there that people would not know how to go about their daily rituals, that they would need to see how they would interact with these new typologies of furniture. It seems kind of hard to believe today, but the main point of many of these showrooms really was education and educating the public about modern ways of living. And also, how do you put together your furniture in the living room if you're not buying a set? If you're not buying the whole thing as one lot, how do you know which chair to buy and whether to get a sofa or not to get a sofa and whether to get a side piece and how that works? So it really was a whole rethinking of the industry. Now, unfortunately, Gilbert Rohde died in 1944, quite suddenly at the dinner table. It was quite tragic and unexpected. And Herman Miller, D.J. Dupree, very quickly cast around for someone to take on the role to continue forward with the modern furniture and the modernization of the company. And they found, here we go, this is fun. Who's this? Dun, 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 dun. Oh, no, I can't stump you guys. You're doing so good. Doing so well, I should say. Anyone? 1, 2, 3. George Nelson. It's all right. He's dead, so he won't know. So, otherwise, his ego would be seriously hurt. So George Nelson came in to follow in Rohde's footsteps, and he really kind of kicked it into high gear. And of course, he had the benefit of really coming in as the post-war period was starting. And that's when, again, the American consumer economy, like in the period following the Great Depression, became the focus of the nation's way out and way forward was really around consumer spending. And George Nelson did something really interesting. I think this, again, is one of these super indicative images of American culture. George Nelson created the storage wall, which was, he felt, Americans have all this stuff, and they don't have any storage, and that's a problem. And these small houses they were building. So he said, why not take a wall and make the wall storage? And it's a storage wall. You got a wall and you have storage. This is pretty brilliant. So instead of having something like this, you have something like this, which is very clean and tucks away all that stuff that we have to buy because we're in the middle of a consumer spending revolution. And this is really about the American way of life and the role of good design and the integration of design within that lifestyle and trying to make that daily experience better and make it better because of how we interact with the things in our lives. And then, of course, there's a connecting the dots that we're doing here. George Nelson brought in Charles and Ray Eames to Herman Miller, along with Isamanda Deguchi and some other very well-known designers today. And so then the Eames came into the Herman Miller family and brought their own philosophy to the company, and one of which we're all still living with today. And essentially, just for the record, this is a room that was designed by the Eames for the For Modern Living exhibition, and this was held at the Detroit Institute of the Arts in 1949. For history buffs, it's really interesting. There's a catalog you can probably get in the library and look at the various rooms that were put on display. So they asked a number of designers to create a modern room so people could come and see again to understand what modern living looked like. And you can see here that there was this incredible kind of visual porosity and skeletal display that the Eames put together. And they were quite specific in saying that they didn't want people to think this was a room. They wanted people to think of this as a space situation. So this was like something you might interact with. And they said, or Charles Eames said, that he wanted his designs to foster space situations which occur whenever furniture is used. That the objects and accessories, far from attempting to dictate a style, try to suggest an attitude which brings together good furniture, honestly conceived, and those objects of everyday life of which all people grow fond. So the Eames were really positioning attitude as a way of living with design and thinking about how we use objects. And again, like Rhodey and like Nelson, about creating more rewarding situations in the home, and that the individual has the desire or has the ability to create the situation they want, that there isn't a one kind of answer, there isn't a set that someone can buy that's going to make their life work, that it needs to be something much more complex and thoughtful than that. And if we look at, so this is just sort of what I was saying. Charles and Ray Eames, they wrote, it's not conceived of as a special room or a section of a house, but rather suggests an attitude towards the space and the objects. And the kind of living they were looking at is this expansive one, enriched by the special selection and enjoyment of the objects used. And so this is kind of different. It wasn't about just having the objects to have them, a kind of gross consumer consumption, but about being very careful and being very thoughtful about the objects that we live with and what we design so that they have meaning in our lives, specific meaning that gives enjoyment in our lives. And the whole Eames philosophy, which is, this is the kind of familiar story about, working with new materials and new technologies to try to come up with designs that responded to the human condition better. So these are images of the splints that they designed during the Second World War, where they started their molded plywood investigations, which of course led to the lounge chair wood, this very famous iconic chair that we know today. And that was really a result of a long period of research and investigation that had to do with the American, or with the human body and culture and what was needed. So it wasn't, just splints or chairs that the Eames were trying to express or trying to share with their public, but it was this idea of how we live and the things that we live with, and really lifestyle. And this is a big part of the mid-century. And these images and these pieces of furniture, I think, today are so iconic that we sort of forgot where they came from and the context that Charles and Ray Eames were working in and what they were trying to do in terms of changing public perception of dwelling and of the objects that they design. And I think there's something really special and really meaningful in what they did. And then we get something like this. I don't know what this is about. Like, this is crazy to me. We just don't, I don't think we need this. I don't think this helps. This was created by a French furniture designer, Ora Ito, and Fasco jokingly has called this the worst thing in the world. And if you've read it, there's a hilarious blog between these two guys going back and forth about whether or not it's the worst design ever created. It's quite good. You can Google it. But in any event, it's interesting that the designer told Dezeen in a blog, he said, he was asked about the shoe and the design. He said, this could be very nice for a limited edition product, maybe in relation to the Eames Foundation, doing it maybe in a special pack. If Nike wanted to do it, I would go even deeper into the study. You know, it's just a first thought, a quick project, but it's nice to provoke stuff with ideas that can provide a direction, even if it doesn't become a real product. And I just think, no, this doesn't provoke anything but anger in me. Like, what the Eames were doing had integrity. They were trying to say something, but by kind of grafting an Eames aesthetic onto a shoe, which doesn't even make sense, it bastardizes all that the Eames tried to do. So this is my other big argument for tonight. We don't need nostalgic design. I don't think this is helpful. I don't think this is going to take us anywhere useful. There's always something to nostalgia. It takes us to a comfortable place. I think if I would be honest with myself, maybe that's why mid-century modernism is so popular and consistent and persistent in our environment, is that it's very comfortable and comforting for people. And I think it's something that has started to be taken for granted and starts to result in weird things, not only the shoe. I mean, the miniature, it's kind of cute, but again, not particularly useful for anything. Dog's Dish inspired by Eames, I don't think, Rufus really cares. I don't think that's going to change his experience of eating. This one, no, we don't need it. It's fine. It looks all right. But is it really helpful? Is it really changing anything? Is it a better sound? Probably not. This, I don't get it. I don't get it. Like, there's so much we could be doing in terms of prosthetics. Like, why? Why is that in any way useful? I don't understand. So I think there's plenty of things we can care about in terms of design. There's plenty of things we can be angry about, and you can be angry about different things from me. I hope you are. This is just my own personal, attack tonight. But I think there's plenty of things we could focus on that really need concern. And I think design brings a fantastic skill set to almost any challenge, and we need to start applying that to more interesting and more dynamic challenges. So just in case, anyone's grasping around for inspiration, I pulled together a few things that I think we could all probably spend some time thinking about. Might be important. Climate change, you've probably heard of it, right? Yeah. Okay, it's pretty interesting if you do this, which I did. You type into Google, like, scary facts about climate change. You get a lot of stuff. For example, since 1980, 40% of the summer sea ice in the Arctic has disappeared. And this is replaced by a dark ocean, which traps the heat and contributes to more warming. Since May and June of 2014 were the hottest May and June ever recorded on Earth in human history. The average spring in the U.S. now arrives about 12 to 14 days earlier than it did 20 years ago. For every 1 degree in rise in global temperatures, there's a 10% decrease in crop yields. And I could go on. I have a lot of these, but you can look them up for yourself. And this is an interesting one. Just 90 companies have caused 2/3 of the world's carbon pollution. So there's some big companies that are really having an impact. And I know sometimes it feels like something like climate change is just beyond our capacity to intervene. But we can all do something, right? I think, these are the things we should be thinking about, not recreating the Eames in shoe form. Here's another one, poverty. Poverty. Nearly half the world's population, that's 3 billion people, live on less than $2.50 a day. And more than 1.3 billion live in extreme poverty. That's $1.25 a day. I mean, it's incredible. 1 billion children worldwide live in poverty. And according to UNICEF, 22,000 children die each day because of poverty. More than 750 million people lack adequate access to clean drinking water. What else? Preventable diseases like diarrhea and pneumonia take the lives of 2 million children a year who are too poor to afford proper treatment. The World Food Program says the poor are hungry and their hunger traps them in poverty. Hunger is the #1 cause of death in the world, killing more than HIV, AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis combined. And what we're really talking about when we're talking about poverty is inequality. Okay, so inequality is something we're really struggling with today, and it's getting worse all the time. And inequality is really an insidious force because it does a lot of things. Like, it makes it harder to reduce poverty. It undermines economic growth. It makes people unhappy. It's unfair. It undermines democracy and good governance. We look at some countries that are really struggling for all kinds of reasons, and at the heart of it is often inequality. Inequality ultimately squashes human potential. It's really hard to thrive and to be to be what you can be when you're in an environment that's extremely when it's characterized by this kind of inequality that we see around the world more and more, and even it's here, it's everywhere. It's not just in developing nations. Okay, this is the dark part of my talk. Refugees, here's another one if you're still not inspired, something to think about. There are more than 19 million people in the world who are currently refugees. That's a crazy, disastrously high number. And these are people that need to find a place to live. And when we talk about the global refugee crisis, we're really talking about how nations fail people, how they fail refugees, and we're seeing this unfold, in real time right now. And you think about it, in the nations, we fail these people at 4 distinct stages, and we're failing them at every single one. So the first stage, persecution. If where you are at and what you're doing is so bad that it's better to leave everything that you've ever had in the world and flee on foot, that's pretty bad. That's about as bad as the human condition can get. So then you go from there, you go to a refugee camp, and you get to a refugee camp, and that's so bad, after a while you think, I gotta get out of here. So then you flee the camp, stage 3, trying to seek asylum in some other country, which, as we're seeing today, is no easy task. And then finally, to end up in another camp somewhere else. Like, this is the worst kind of human situation. I don't know what the answer is to it, but I think we can think about it, right? We can hope to try to do something about it. This is a little bit from home. This is New Zealand. So in New Zealand, we have a huge problem you wouldn't maybe appreciate here as much, but it's mold in houses, because houses aren't well insulated, and they're damp and they're cold, and it leads to respiratory problems in children, leads to all kinds of diseases, and it's entirely preventable. The New Zealand government could put some more money into making healthy homes, putting in insulation, putting in windows, but they don't, and it's a consistent problem. And again, it's nations and governments that are letting people down. And then this is my final one: child consumers. If you, again, still have thought these are all too big of problems, this is one I think any designer can choose not to engage with at the very least. Children are a captive audience. The average American child watches, this is unbelievable, estimate 25,000 to 40,000 television commercials per year. That's unbelievable. And this is $15 to $17 billion spent by companies in advertising to children in the US each year. Over $4 billion was spent just by the fast food industry alone. So this is why my children love McDonald's. Big fans. And the marketing really seems to be worth it. In the US, teens spend about $160 billion a year. Children up to age 11 spend about $18 billion a year, and everyone's favorite, the tweens, heavily influence more than $30 billion in spending by their parents. So children really wield quite enormous purchasing power, either directly or indirectly through their parents. And I read this, I hadn't realized that there's a lot of people that research just this, but the minivan, for example, was created because children were demanding more room. And they wanted more room, but then kids decided that this minivan was uncool. We're all familiar with this. So what can we do? Well, let's get the SUV, right? And so the SUV, in many ways, is the extension of the minivan, because that's more palatable to today's families and to kids. And James McNeil, who's a market researcher specializing in the children's market, says every auto manufacturer recognizes this and has a strategy to target children. So you think when somebody's designing cars, the last person that would be on their mind is an 8-year-old, but apparently it's the first. So what the company, these are products too, this is crazy, just as a side note. In New Zealand, the grocery stores do these things where if you spend 20 bucks, you get a little prize for spending $20. And they're miniature food products. And then your children are supposed to collect all the food products. So you have to like shop enough to get this whole collection of miniature plastic things to train your children to be consumers. It's so insane, but they love it. It's crazy. So I guess what I'm talking about is essentially, you know, what I think we need really is more manifestos. We need more passion, and we need to be really thinking about what we're doing. And so to come to, you know, Alan's manifesto that gave the title to my talk, you know, I think his point is really important, that we, you know, first do no harm. It's a good starting point for everyone. And it's especially good for designers. The idea that every decision, every curve that you specify is multiplied by thousands and millions. And not just in the immediate multiplication of something that's being mass produced, but what I'm trying to argue tonight is that there is a continuum. There's a life that lives beyond the product. There's a life that lives beyond the application. There's a consequence to each one of those things, and they add up to more. So if we look at, I think, some designers that are using their skill and their power and talent as designers to do more, there's some great stories, and I think some inspiration for all of us. So this is, oh, okay, let's do it again. Who's this on the tank? This was quite recent. Anybody know? Yes?
I knew it, but I don't remember the name.
Oh, no one? It's okay. Vivienne Westwood, she's, you know, yeah. So Vivienne Westwood, I mean, she's an amazing advocate, and in particular, she's a strident anti-fracking campaigner, and she's condemned the practice as a crime against humanity, and she regularly appears in anti-fracking protests. So recently, she stormed David Cameron's house, the Prime Minister of the UK, and went in with this white tank and rode in with her sort of big shoulder pads and a bunch of people in camouflage, and really made a statement. I mean, it was a bit of a press stunt, obviously, but she was using her, you know, her background as a fashion designer and someone who's used the media for a long time to get some attention and to say, you know, this is not okay. We can't be doing fracking and consider ourselves to be protecting our own humanity. So, and this is something she's done for a long time. I mean, she's been an advocate, and she's been someone who's a kind of a political agent throughout her career. In fact, when she started in the 1970s, she was heavily engaged in the British punk rock scene, which hopefully you're all aware of, and she opened the shop Sex. And it was really a place wherein the British youth, the working class youth, were reacting to a system that was not supporting them, and there was high unemployment, and it was thought that they were quite alienated, and so the punk movement became a way of them expressing themselves and sort of pushing back against the establishment and the system. And you know, it's a story we all know, but Vivienne Westwood used her role as a fashion designer and someone who is out there in the public to say more than just making, you know, nice looking clothes. Now, if we look to a couple examples from today that I think are some people doing some really interesting things, this is a company called Liveable Products, and they produce a family of products that they describe as fair design. And they look all over the world to find places where they can reduce waste and create jobs and create new economic strategies for places that are really struggling. For example, this is a project they're running out of the Philippines in Cebu City, which is the home of the largest port in the Philippines. And while it's an attractive source of income for many, it's also an environment that creates opportunities for pollution and poverty and crime. So they went in there with their Hope project to try to support the communities that were living there by recycling rope that was coming out of the port. So they work with the materials that are commonly sold to fishermen and farmers, and they work with the local community to create new craft products using these recycled materials and using their indigenous skills. So this is an example of some of the livable products that came out of the rope project. And they have a manifesto, and they said, our idea is simple. We screen an environment for interesting materials. By collaborating with local people, we give them the opportunity to use traditional skills. Our goal is to create jobs for the community on a sustainable level and support them in their livelihood. At the same time, we create environmental awareness, reaching a new revolution of industries, actually seeing the value of transforming discarded materials into design products. So it's a really nice story, and they're trying to do something that uses their design talents that also has added benefits to people in communities that really need a hand. This is another great project. This is the ABC syringe that was designed by David Swan. So the ABC stands for a behavior changing syringe. And it was designed to tackle a really significant healthcare problem. It's estimated by the World Health Organization that up to 40% of the 40 billion injections that are administered each year are delivered with syringes that are being reused without sterilization. And this is responsible for large populations, large portions of cases of HIV and hepatitis, and they think responsible for upwards of 3 million deaths a year. Because the problem is in poorer communities, people will scrounge around for syringes and then resell them so that they get reused. So the idea is really, really simple, like many of the best solutions are. So it's a plastic syringe that's colorless, and it remains that way as long as it's in its nitrogen, which you can see at the end, a filled pack. But when it's opened and it's exposed to air, it slowly, well not too slowly, over the course of 1 minute, it changes from light pink to dark red. So that the dark red signifies been used, don't use again. And they did this great study where they would go around and ask even illiterate communities, like, which one of these syringes is safe? And no one would pick the red one. Everyone sort of recognized that means it's been used, it's not good. So this won the 2014 World Design Impact Prize, and it's been applauded in the community for finding a way to solve very simply a really dramatic problem. And this is quite nice. I just discovered this project. When we were talking about the refugee crisis, I thought, that's a big one to dump on designers, because that's a massive political situation. It's hard to even think, how do you get access to it? So I heard a radio program, and they were interviewing Chris Milk, who's well known for doing sort of Kanye West videos and Arcade Fires, and he's kind of like a cool art film director guy. But he was approached by the UN to work on a project that would help raise awareness and empathy of the situation for refugees. And this is called Clouds Over Sidra. And it's it's an initiative, as I said, that was put forward by the UN. And the idea was to create deeper empathy and understanding in individuals within the UN and beyond for the people that are living in these really tremendously challenging conditions. So and he's using virtual reality. Like, it's proprietary. He has a system, I think he's developed himself, like the Oculus Rift, where you can go in and have an immersive experience sitting inside the refugee tents and talking to the individuals that are living there and following the day in the life of a 12-year-old girl. So it's great to see someone who's obviously made lots and lots of money doing big fancy projects, taking on something that's really about making hopefully a contribution and helping raise awareness about something that we all need to think about. So, as I said at the beginning, I guess what I wanted to do tonight is is to really just ask you to, what is it you care about? What do you want to do as a designer? What do you have to say? Because your voice matters. It really matters what you guys do. And there's so many interesting and complex problems in the world. And I just hope that you take them on. I hope that that's inspiring for you and that you go out and, however small, what you do has consequence. And it can lead to something that can be a really tremendous step forward for all of us. So good luck in the consequence business, and I hope to read about you somewhere, sometime, someday. So thank you. I mean, that's the trick, isn't it, right? Like, intention isn't enough, because how do you begin to predict those unintended consequences, and how do you know? And I think that's the missing piece that only time will provide. And that's why I'm saying it's easy for me as a historian to kind of say, look back and piece together a narrative that links together those bits that you can't see right now. That's the really hard part. But I guess what you can try to do is look as broadly as possible. Try to imagine what you can't imagine. But that's part of what design does really well, is to start to think about what the unintended consequences might be. And that means going beyond the intention. So the intention you start with, right? But then play it out. And that's the speculative part. Play out where it might go if you succeed at doing what you intend to do. So I think the problem we tend to have is that we focus on what we want to achieve and looking at that and getting there as perfectly as possible, but we don't think what happens next. And that's the scary part, because that is speculative. But I think that's the role of whether you call it critical design or speculative design or fiction, design fiction. But I think those kinds of strategies can be really useful and playing the narrative out further than you intend. Yeah. I mean, but in many ways, none of those issues are new. It's just new technology. I remember when complex fluorescents came out, and there's mercury in each one of those, and the industry was just selling them as hard as they could, but not even providing places for them to be safely recycled. So if you throw your compact fluorescent into the rubbish bin, and then that goes into a landfill, and it breaks open, over time, multiplied by all the people who have compact fluorescents, that's mercury that's going into the soil. Is not a good thing. And companies are really happy to just sort of sidestep that. Oh, well, we're working on a recycling plan, and IKEA was going to have some collecting points, but then they didn't really say what they were going to do with them. So industry is always really good at looking at the market and saying, this is going to give you more power or more light for less, so it's going to save you money, so this is a good thing, and it's greener for the planet, meanwhile not mentioning any of the environmental issues associated with it. And then, there's the question around light health. So different wavelengths of light have different effects on us psychologically, physiologically. I think there's a lot of potential with LEDs because it's a fundamentally different kind of light. We've never had a light like an LED. Before, it's always been, an incandescent or a fluorescent, which has a limited kind of wavelength. LEDs, because it's a computer programmable light source, can do almost anything. And I think what I'm waiting to see, what I'm really excited about, is when some people decide to start trying to explore what that means. Because what usually happens, you get a new technology that's a little smarter than the technology you had before. So you try to do what you were doing before, but better. But occasionally a technology comes along that's totally different, but it takes people a while to figure out what that means and what that whole new world that they haven't seen will look like, because they have to start thinking like, okay, so we have ceiling lights and they cast down, or we have these kind of accent lights, so let's do those lights better. But we could have, luminous walls, floors, fabrics, clothing that's all programmable, that's smart, that can, like there's so much stuff we can do with that technology that we're just starting to see experimentation with. So I'm hoping that people will figure that out and start doing some stuff that just really blows our minds, but we haven't got there yet. But I could talk for a really long time about lighting and just bore everybody, so I might stop there, unless you want to hear more. Thanks. Sure. Well, I think that's the reality, yeah. I think you have to work around the industry. I mean, you can go work for industry, and hopefully you can take your philosophy with you, and if it's a company that has some openness, and not all companies are evil, I don't think they're all bad. I think, things happen that shouldn't happen, and sometimes it's not intentional, it's unintentional, or it's just someone wasn't looking at the big picture, they were just looking at the bottom line. So I can't tell you which companies to go to work for. I mean, that's something you're going to have to decide on your own. But I also think, and this is again just slightly speculative, this is what I think, so you can take it at whatever value you want, that we're in a period of a very rapid transformation of economic models and businesses and how companies perform. I mean, you look at a company that owns more accommodation than any other company in the world, but doesn't have a single hotel or apartment, Airbnb, right? You look at the world's largest taxi company and they don't own a single car, right? Yeah. So there's a disruption that's happening today that's shaking everything up. And I don't know where that's going to end up, but you have the amazing potential with things like, Kickstarter accounts and people who are doing social enterprise and are looking at new models of business and new ways of creating profit and new ways of putting themselves out in the market, which doesn't just mean going to work for IBM or Apple or some of the traditional big companies. Whether or not there's room for everyone to start their own company, I don't know. I mean, I also am a little fearful of this idea that everybody can be an entrepreneur and can start their own company. But I think that there are probably more avenues for you to express yourself and do what you want to do with your professional lives than there probably ever have been before. But the onus is on you to figure that out. I would love to see that happen. I would love to think that is possible. I've been involved with a group of individuals from all the universities in New Zealand that teach design, and we've put together a group called DesignCo, which is about trying to provide some thought leadership in terms of what design can do to bring benefit socially, economically, culturally, politically, to culture, to societies. We haven't got into Parliament yet. We don't have anyone in office, so it hasn't actually taken off. But the idea that we even got together, as leaders in the university, the tertiary sector, to say we think design can make a difference and we think it has a voice more than ever today, and we have to be the first ones to be accountable and to say that and to come forward and be positive and be strong and have something to offer, because it's fine to say that. But where's the proof and what are we doing? So I think we need both. We need to start demonstrating how we're creating positive change in the world, and then we need to take credit for it and start advocating, not just going around the political machine, but working through it. And I think that's a really new role for design. You haven't seen that much in the history. But design itself, like if we talk about it in the way I'm defining it, like kind of starting with your Raymond Loewy's, it's a very young profession. It's a very young discipline. So we're still starting out. We're still working on it. But I think it would be fantastic if design could get into the political realm more. Well, I mean, I purposely didn't put, the iPhone up there because I think that's such a huge, and it's not just the iPhone, but the whole kind of like smart computer we carry in our pocket is fundamentally changing all of human society. Like that's big. But so maybe to scale back just to the question of, is there a role for the kind of classic designer, product designer who makes beautiful things. I'm sure, like, you know, human beings like aesthetically pleasing things. People want to spend their money on something that they can show, that shows their taste, that shows their education, that shows that they can appreciate this beautiful thing. I just don't want to contribute to that. I don't want to be a part of that. I'm not saying it's inherently evil. I just think there are so many beautiful vases and chairs and lamps in the world that if all it's doing in terms of its innovation is being more beautiful than the one before, it's just not interesting to me. But it is probably interesting to some. So I think we like the hero. We like this sort of auteur or artist, genius figure. It's something that is part of our culture. So I don't think we won't see the end of that. I just feel like, especially in where I teach, you know, we have a lot of very young people who kind of come into design thinking, I want to make like really beautiful stuff. And so I feel like I need to say there's more options than that if you want. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it's a good point because, funnily enough, when I started at the School of Design at Victoria University, there was this sort of back chatter about, you know, sustainable design and like the S word, and we weren't going to talk about that because it's all ugly and, you know, nasty and like whole weedy kind of stuff. Like, who wants this stuff that's just about do-goodery in the world? So I think it's not an either or. It's just, you know, why can't you take that same integrity and intelligence and desire to make something really wonderful in the world, which is beautiful, which is pleasing, which enhances life, but that also does something to help make the world a better place or help steer us in the right direction. Because ultimately, I think what good design does is it convinces us to do something or use something or behave in a certain way. That, you know, the reason why, you know, the iPhone screen works the way it does is there's a lot of interaction design that went into there, and so it's being as easy and as beautiful and as smooth and all of that it can be. And there's no reason why we can't take that same process and try to do something that maybe has some political intention, or that maybe will make me want to drive my car less. Maybe there's something about something that you design that makes me want to walk more, or that makes me want to ride the bus. Or you know what I mean? So I think it really should be both, because ultimately if it doesn't make us feel better, if it doesn't look better, if it doesn't add value to our lives, no matter how good it is for the rest of the world, we're probably going to go with the thing that's easier, that we like better, that makes us feel better. Because at the end of the day, we're all really selfish. I mean, I'm that way too. I'm not like, you know, I have my bad habits, and I'm waiting for people to design things that convince me to have better habits. But I think we need that, and that's what design is good at, is convincing us to do things. Always has been. So no, it shouldn't be ugly. It should work well. Yeah. I don't know. I usually like to blame that on the engineers, but. What's that? Yeah, and I think often, sometimes there's also this sort of secondary prejudice that if it looks too nice, that it can't be important, which I think is ridiculous, and that there's no reason to continue that kind of thought. Yeah. So I mean, I hope, and when you see, you know, like I think that ABC syringe, like that's a great looking syringe. That's a really nice looking syringe. As far as syringes go, it's one of the better looking ones. And it solves a problem, and it's cheap, and, you know, they can get it out there. So I think that's a good example of you don't have to compromise. I mean, sometimes you do, but you have to make the best of your compromises, I guess. Any other questions? I think what I always have to tell my thesis students is generally scale it back. Whatever it is you're trying to do, like cut it down by 80% and focus on the one little bit that it's really the beating heart of what it is you want to achieve. Because you're going to want to do all of this, you know, and you're all inspired. You want to change the world and end poverty and inequality and solve the refugee crisis and climate change tonight. You can't, right? Like, you're not really gonna be able to do that. But maybe you can do one little thing. Maybe, you know, you can figure out one little thing. And the better you focus on that very little thing, the bigger and better the whole project will be. So generally speaking, what happens when people fall down in the thesis process is that they're trying to go in too many directions at once. They're trying to take on too much, and they're trying to make it look important. But it gets more convincing and more important the more focused it is. So that would be my sage advice, yes. Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's why I tried to, at the end, show some examples of work that are very simple. Like the idea, I'm going to go into a Filipino port city. I'm going to look around. I see there's a lot of rope that's being, you know, cast. I've got an idea. Okay, maybe we can teach these people how to recycle it and rebraid it and create new products. Or gosh, I just read that 3 million people die each year because they have a dirty syringe. Like, it's a small contribution, but when we think about the consequences, wow, you could save millions of lives by doing something really, really simple. So I think, you know, you start here, and this is with most research projects, is you have this really big idea, and what you have to do is just constantly refine and refine and refine and refine and get down to that one contribution that you can actually make. Because it's much better to deliver on something real than to, you know, sort of hypothesize about all this fantastic stuff that you can't really do. So I think, yeah, definitely, whatever your interest is, just refine. Well, I think it kind of gets to the first question I had, which is that, you know, how do we figure out the bits we can't see, right? That we just can't quite know what's going to sit there. And I think the advantage of my training as a historian is that it's much easier to see those things in the past, and if we put the past next to the present and we pull away things like different technologies and contemporary situations, the fundamental kind of human needs and questions are almost the same. The same problems we were dealing with in the 1940s, it's not that long ago. A lot of ways, the same problems we're dealing with today. And by having that ability to look further than your immediate surroundings, it affords you an extraordinary vision as a designer. So I think, and this is why, you know, I think it's really important to keep some amount of design history and criticism and theory and design programs, studio programs, because it's under fire, because everything's more and more specialized today, and we don't have time for the humanities, and we don't have time for all this value add kind of business. But it's that context and knowing that context that allows you to have a better vision of what's happening today, because you can see it in a bigger perspective. And I think that perspective allows you to fill in some of the holes that are more difficult. And also just to not do the same thing again, to know, okay, that was a really interesting innovation. Like, that was something that had, you know, this context and this implication. Now, you know, what can I do beyond that today? Or how can I take that idea and apply it to a new context and new technology and new applications? So I think it's really essential. Not everybody agrees with me. Some design students would be very happy to never have to take a design history class. But I think it's valuable. I mean, yeah. I think so. I mean, I think more than anything else, it just grounds you that much more in your practice. Like, you know where the discipline came from and what its foundations are. And I think there's a confidence and a knowledge that comes from that. But I also think, and this was the argument from the beginning, really, many designers, that if design is to really have value, it has to be in the process of whatever we're engaged with investigating from the very first outset. Otherwise, you just end up like Loewe putting a new, you know, wrapper around a refrigerator, and that doesn't really have so much value. I mean, design has a lot of value when it's integral to the process, whatever that may be, rather than something that's tacked on at the end, as, you know, styling or value add, what have you, then it's not really, its potential is completely missed. I don't think society or consumers, these big, massive sort of generalizations of people, but let's say they're not gonna really jump up and down and call for change. Because like I was saying earlier, especially if you're in a good situation, and that means you control resources and you control the economic wealth and the political scene in the world, basically, you're not in such a bad way. And not everyone is so empathetic to put aside their own comfort to support someone they don't know on the other side of the world who's really suffering. So I think that, again, that's why design has to come in, and I don't think on that macro scale, but on the micro scale, so that if every decision, every project you take on as a designer, you think about not only your intention, but to the consequences of it, and if there is some capacity in what you're doing, even in the smallest kind of feather in the wind contribution that might help out in a bigger way down the track. I think change has to be very bottom up, and it has to be, again, integrated into all that you do. And that's why I think it's really a mindset and it's a philosophy as a designer or a practitioner, or whatever you end up doing, if it's not design, that there's some part of your process that wants to think about, is what I'm doing going to point ever so slightly in a direction that's better, or is it just going to keep us on the path that we're on? And fundamentally, I think that's how it's going to happen. If we sit around and wait for people to demand it, it's going to be a long wait, I think. Well, I mean, I think that's what's tricky. I guess that's what I was trying to say. We're in a funny moment historically, because the kind of corporate business models, the economic kind of structure of so many countries around the world is being challenged by distributed technologies and the ability to sidestep all of that. And people like Uber, like Airbnb, who are really clever, have seen the advantage of that in terms of building something really quickly, really powerful, that's going to change the industry. But whether or not they've thought about the ethical nature of what they're doing, what that means to people who are driving the cars, what happens to tax revenue that was coming from, there's all kinds of questions that we're starting to have to face now, because we didn't predict this. We didn't see this coming, and it got so big before most people even noticed it, that now it's like a behemoth. Like, what do we even do? I mean, the whole debate in New York City around, what happens to Uber. You can just see that these are very, very powerful companies now that started from, someone that had an idea like, I could build a smarter machine. But I think in the coming years, those questions have got to be asked, because I think it could get out of control really quickly if people don't kind of keep some ethical and moral intention to what they're doing, because I think there's probably a lot more to come like that if we don't. I don't know. I don't even know how it works. In terms of, is it regulation? Is it how do we manage it? But I guess if you're out there and you're thinking about where you're going to go and you're going to start your own company, I hope that that's something you think about, and think about what that means to the people who are engaging with what you do and what you're selling. Yeah, but it's tough. We don't know. Yeah, I mean, well, there's a whole methodology about that. How you can go and you don't come into a community and say, I've got a great solution for you. Here you go. Enjoy. From my happy, first world nation, I give you this gift that's going to transform your society, and maybe you didn't want it. I think if you're really serious about working with struggling communities or developing nations, then you need to have a very ethnographic, you have to go in there and work with people. You don't want to provide them the answers. You want to help them find answers for themselves. Again, you can use your design skill set. You can go in and facilitate, but it's the idea of working with and for communities, not just kind of coming in and imposing design solutions. And I think that if that's where you kind of see yourself going, there are a lot of people that have talked about that and write about that and have developed some really sound and sensible methods for working, with communities, particularly other cultures. And I think it's something you always have to be very, very mindful of. But just to get on the other side of it too, I mean, something like the ABC Syringe, I think something like that is quite good because it's something that's already in the society. It's a syringe that's being used by the World Health Organization, and I think that is okay to go and say. But to step in and try to change someone's culture with your design intervention, it's delicate territory. And so, I mean, I didn't really dwell on that. It's not necessarily my area of expertise, but like I said, there's lots of good people out there in development studies departments and other places where you can get some good philosophies on how to approach working with communities. Yeah, you had a question, Stel?
I'm really curious about what you're talking about, and one of the reasons that I'm here is that I really like this approach that Alan had talked about with this idea of the consequence business. And something that I'd stumbled upon in my undergrad was this idea of, I think it's called Mesthenes law, which is that anytime that you apply a technological solution to a social problem, there's always going to be consequences that come out of that are most likely going to be, there's always going to be negative consequences that come out of that. And I think that when you go through the design history, that's something that you see, like Lowy, for example, was sort of propelling this idea in order to get us out of the economic hole that we were in. And the idea of the sales graph wasn't necessarily, he didn't think it was beautiful because the shareholders were happy, right? But because this may help to lift up the social good or society in general. But all of the unintended consequences or the negative consequences about sort of like this hyper-consumerism that came about it now we're dealing with that many years later. And so it seems like the one constant that you see in the history of design is that no matter how great people's intentions are, there's always going to be a multitude of negative consequences that come out of that. So do you know if there is an organization or a body that is trying to develop some sort of shared value system that we have, or some like logic tree that you could almost go through to say, no matter what, there's going to be negative consequences that are going to come out of this. Like, does the good outweigh the potential bad with this? Because you can't really you can't have something that's so holistic and so great. Even the idea of no longer recycling syringes so that people don't die. Now that means those syringes are no longer, they're not being recycled. Now we have ones that are just being disposed of. That increases plastic, right? All that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So do you feel like that might be a first step, or do you know of an organization who might be trying to sort of say, no matter what, there's going to be something bad? How do we start to weigh that?
I mean, there's not a single organization that's popping to my mind at the moment. I mean, there's lots of organizations that have a kind of healthy ethical outlook and are trying to promote good and ethical behavior through design. But I think ultimately, like you say, I mean, it's sort of unavoidable, and it has to do with the fact that we can't always predict the unintended consequences or how something might be adapted or co-opted, or the way in which it might influence people to do things that we just didn't see coming. But I also think that's the classic mistake that designers tend to make, is that like we're putting finished things into the world and done, now do your magic or whatever, when in reality, like you say, there's going to be some good and then there's going to be some bad, and then somebody else needs to come along. And so even in that finished project is the starting of an iterative new design process. So I think it's more important probably that we remain agile and iterative and never see something as being finished, and that as we see these unintended consequences coming out, or this negative outcome of something that we approached in a very positive way, thinking it would, to get back in there and address it, rather than just saying, oof, didn't see that coming. And so knowing that, you don't really get to be finished with something, or maybe you're approaching a problem that someone else created. Because I think again that gets to the philosophy and the outlook of where you are. But it'd be great if there was more advocating for that, and if there was some kind of sort of logic tree you could go through to know in advance what was going to happen. But I don't know if that's possible. But I think maybe just knowing that the work is never done is probably the best. Yeah. Any other questions, or should we call it quits? Never quit. There you go. That's a good one. And thank you guys. Thanks for awesome questions.